1864. New Year's 1864 rolls around. The Union stood victorious on all fronts of the war. However, it was by no means assured that the war was going to end anytime soon. The South was still stubbornly resisting all attempts to crush it militarily. So what was going on? The Mississippi River was entirely in Union hands. The South had been split in half. Lee's second invasion of the North had been stopped cold at Gettysburg. That would be the final time that the South would fight strategically on the offensive. General Ulysses Sampson Grant, fresh from his victories in the West, now commanded all the Union armies, including the one in the East against Robert E. Lee. However, the old defenses around Richmond were as strong as ever, and the rebel soldiers still fought hard. However, long-term hope for the South was fading as the blockade grew ever tighter. The Emancipation Proclamation had disrupted the slave system, and the Union victories of the year 1863 made foreign intervention all but hopeless. Let's start our story again in the West, which is now moving east. We remember from last time that General Grant, after his victory at Vicksburg, had brought his army to southeast Tennessee around the city of Chattanooga. In the Chattanooga campaign, he had pushed the Confederates back into Georgia. After that, Grant left to take up command of the army in the east. And then what would happen, he left his trusted lieutenant, General William Tecumseh Sherman, that's letter A. After Grant left the Western Army to take up command in Washington, General William Tecumseh, or William T. Sherman, took over in command of this vast Western Army. His soldiers numbered about 115,000. His mission for the year that General Grant left him said, all right, listen up. What you need to do is take the city of Atlanta. Atlanta is actually the largest city in the South. It is an important industrial center. Lots of guns and cannons and bullets and uniforms are manufactured there, and then they are sent by rail up to the armies in Virginia. Atlanta is the big goal. Sherman is facing off against General Joseph E. Johnston, a defensive wizard, outside the city of Atlanta. He only has about 55,000 troops compared to General Sherman's 115,000, but he was an excellent commander and would not let Sherman bring his entire force to bear. And basically, this several weeks, months-long campaign between Chattanooga and Atlanta is a constant attempt by General Sherman to move his army around to the left of General Johnston, and then General Johnston blocking, and then General Sherman again attempting to move around the left, and General Johnston blocking. And then Sherman kind of tried the other side, try to move around to the right. General Johnston blocking. One time, General Sherman tries a frontal assault at a place called Kennesaw Mountain, but it was unsuccessful. General Johnston, the Southern general, sort of has a plan. He's hoping, it's a political plan more than anything. General Johnston is hoping by the summer of 1864 that he can hold General Sherman off long enough for the presidential election in the North to happen. It's a strategic political goal that General Johnston has outside of Atlanta. He knows that Northern opinion had been growing weary of this seemingly endless war. And the only thing the South kind of had going for it was they're sitting there saying to themselves, okay, let's hold on until the election of 1864, and if Lincoln loses, whoever replaces him might be, because it would be a Democrat, would be willing to negotiate. So letter A, Northern opinion had been growing weary of the endless war, and at this point the South was betting on the North replacing Lincoln in the 1864 election. So General Johnston down here in the South, all he wants to do is sort of hold Sherman off. And he's fighting this war of maneuver around the city of Atlanta, trying to hold Johnston off. However, the South, with its aggressive spirit, is growing tired of the defensive-minded Johnston. And they want him to counterattack. Slowly but surely, as you can see, the Union Army had been getting closer and closer to Atlanta. So Johnston is replaced by Confederate President Jefferson Davis with General John Bell Hood, known as Sam, an excellent division commander known for his bold aggressiveness. Hood decides, even though he is outnumbered, to go on the attack. Hood attacks north of Atlanta, the Union lines. Sherman digs himself in, and the Confederate attack was repulsed. Hood tries again. He attacks 3 times in 3 separate battles north of the city of Atlanta, and Sherman easily pushes him back all 3 times. After those series of assaults, the Southern Army was in no position to stop Sherman from taking the city of Atlanta. And on the 1st of September, after suffering heavy losses and wasting all that Johnston had won, Hood pulls back out of Atlanta. He evacuates Atlanta. He burns the city, destroys everything of value. And the next day, September the 2nd, Union troops entered the largest city in the South. The victory at Atlanta had consequences that went far beyond military consequences. The victory of Atlanta pretty much guaranteed the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. And we're going to talk about that later in the blog. Lincoln was running against George McClellan, the general, the former general. He was running on the Democratic ticket. And until this victory at Atlanta, it looked that General McClellan might defeat Lincoln in the presidential election. But the victory at Atlanta kind of galvanized the Union into finishing what they had started. And the victory was in early September. 8 weeks later, the Union voted overwhelmingly to keep Lincoln as president, and Lincoln's re-election ended the South's last hope for a negotiated settlement. Now they would either win or be completely forced back into the Union, and it did not look like they were going to be able to win. Hood takes his army and retreats into Tennessee, hoping to draw Sherman behind him. Okay? He wants Sherman to follow him up into Tennessee, where he hopes to disrupt the Union supply lines and use the mountainous region here in eastern Tennessee to kind of even the odds. Sherman says, fine, I'll meet you halfway. Sherman, with his much larger army, divides his army and does send a part of his army after Hood in Tennessee. And in a series of battles known as the Franklin-Nashville Campaign, Hood is again ridiculously over-aggressive. And what eventually happens is Hood's troops are pretty much destroyed and retreat all the way to Mississippi, where they will end the war. The Confederate Army of the Tennessee that had fought its way with great bravery all the way from the Mississippi River to Vicksburg and across to Tennessee and through Atlanta ceased to be an effective fighting force. Hood tries to blame his subordinates and his troops, but he is removed from command and not given another. And the remaining troops, the remaining Confederate troops in Georgia, in the Carolinas, were given back to General Johnston to do whatever he could against Sherman's force that was left here in Atlanta. What Sherman did from Atlanta became one of the most famous episodes of the war and one of the most famous things in all of modern military history, and that's letter E. It's called Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman's left with about 70,000 men in and around Atlanta. And Sherman developed a plan to break, this is number 2, Sherman developed a plan to break the South's economic and psychological ability to end the war. To break the South's economic and psychological ability to continue the war. And what Sherman's plan was very simple. He would take his army, and instead of following Hood into Tennessee, would leave their supply lines entirely and drive straight through Georgia, all the way to the sea, living off what they could carry and what they could get from the land. So if they came upon a farmhouse with food, they would take all the food. If they came upon a barn with cows, they'd slaughter the cows for meat and leave the barn behind. Anything that they couldn't, and then they wouldn't just leave the barn behind, they'd burn it. Anything that they needed, they took. Anything that they did not need, they burned. He would, letter B, Sherman's plan was to destroy everything else in his path. Take what he needed, destroy whatever he didn't. There is no army here to face him. He's not focusing on the military aspects of war, but on the economic and psychological effects. So on November the 15th, Sherman left Atlanta and headed for the city of Savannah. And he didn't just go in one skinny column. He goes in 3 wide groups, cutting a swath of destruction across the entire state of Georgia. There's no force left in the southern part of the Confederacy to make a stand against these 70,000 men. It's pretty much, it's not a battle, it's not a fight, it's a march across the state of Georgia. To add insult to injury, Sherman picked a regiment of Southern Unionists. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, some people in the South remained loyal to the Union, put their own regiments together, and went north to help. And of all the people Sherman chooses to lead this march, out at the head of these columns were Southern Unionists, to add insult to injury. Every house they came upon, they took all the stuff, burned the house, burned the barn, killed the animals, and moved on. It's what's known as letter B, total war. Total war is defined as attacking anything that the enemy needs to fight. So that meant that's physical, spiritual, psychological, economic. Sherman's troops burned farms, houses, barns, crops that they didn't eat. Not only that, letter B, Sherman and his troops called for slaves to run away from their masters and join them. That news came out that the Union troops went around saying, "Slaves, leave your masters, come to the Union Army. You will not be a slave anymore. You'll be free as soon as you step foot in under the protection of the Union Army." And thousands upon thousands of slaves did. That the rumors of Sherman's march spread throughout Georgia, and slaves pretty much dropped what they were doing, took their families, and went to the Union Army. And there were very few white Southern men left to stop them. They were either in the army, had been killed or wounded, or had just kind of given up psychologically. Sherman's troops, they took the rail lines and they pulled up the metal and they heated them and they twisted the metal rails around trees, and they became known as Sherman's bow ties, so that the Confederacy couldn't even repair the railroads after the troops had left. Sherman and his troops cut, like we said, a 60-mile wide swath of utter destruction across the heart of the Old South. And he reached the city of Savannah on December 10th after traveling 300 miles. The Confederates try to defend the city of Savannah, but after a brief siege, they escape into South Carolina. And Sherman telegraphs President Lincoln on the 26th of December 1864 and offers him up the city of Savannah as a Christmas present, 1864. The results of this march. It's one of history's first examples of total war, which is something that would come to define the 20th century. World War I and World War II are not just battles between armies, but battles between entire populations, where civilian homes, economic factories, the nation's psyche is all considered to be fair game for the conduct of the war. Not only that, the Confederacy has been cut in half again. And nothing from the old lower South can now reach General Lee with his only real strong remaining Confederate army up in Virginia. So letter B, the Confederacy has been split in half again. Letter D, Sherman's name becomes infamous in the South. For the most part, the Union troops behaved well. They did not physically attack civilians. But when you have a force of 70,000, that's a lot of men. And that's a lot of men that the officers managed to control for the most part, but there are instances of rape of Southern women, murder of Southern civilians. It happened, it was not common, but the name Sherman becomes a curse word in the South for at least 100 years. Letter E, although, like we said, it's not a battle, very few things in the war led to such psychological consequences as Sherman's march. It announced something to the South. It announced to those, hello, South! We, the Union, can go wherever we want. You cannot stop us. We can march with our army through the heart of your country, and you have nothing there to stop us. It is terribly destructive psychologically. And what that does, letter F, the will to keep fighting throughout the Deep South, the heart of secession, is broken. No one is really coming forth to volunteer. Lots of the soldiers are looking for excuses to desert. The militia is called out, but everyone ignores it. That the will to fight in this, people start hoarding. They no longer send food to the army. They no longer accept Confederate money as payment. People start looking beyond the war to, oh my God, how are we going to survive the next year or two? Sherman's march breaks the South's will to fight. And at the end of 1864, General Sherman sat fat and happy here in the city of Savannah, having successfully taken Atlanta, marched all the way across Georgia, and now the western theater of the war has come to the Atlantic Ocean. The South has been cut in half again. But what's going on in the East? And this is the most important theater of the war. What happens in the West is vital, obviously, but in order for the Union to win this war, General Lee has to be beaten. And so far, no one has been able to beat General Lee in Virginia. General Lee has lost when he's invaded the North, but every attempt to invade Virginia, Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, has all ended in terrible Union defeats. So what's going to go on in the East in 1864? First of all, the Union finally has an aggressive fighter in command. Ulysses S. Grant, now in charge, takes the Federal Army, and now for the 1861, twice in 1862, once in 1863, for the fifth, it says fourth in your notes, but it's actually the fifth, General Grant in charge, the Federal Army now moved for the fifth time towards Richmond, Virginia. Grant has 120,000 men under his command. Lee has barely 60,000. And not only that, Lee's men are beginning to grow very short of food shoes, and other non-military supplies. Can we see that? Yeah, it's perfect. All right, letter B. This is going to come to be called the Overland Campaign. One word, overland, like it's moving overland, but it's one word, Overland Campaign. At the beginning of 1864, or at the campaign season of 1864, General Lee has his army defending along the Rapidan River and the wilderness up in the north. Can you see that? North of Richmond. Let's kind of associate our map here. Here's the city of Richmond. That's the goal. The Union Army and the Confederate Army are up here in the north. In June of 1864, a series of battles take place that's known as the Overland Campaign. The first is number 3, the Battle of the Wilderness. General Grant moves to attack General Lee. General Lee purposely fights in the wilderness to kind of even the odds. May 4th, 1864, Grant crosses the river. Lee then, showing his aggressiveness, attacks Grant in these woods. The fighting in these woods was described by the men who fought there to be some of the most difficult, bloody, and crazy fighting of the war. It's fighting in thick woods. You can't see much of anything beyond a few feet in front of you. For 3 days, the main units of the two armies are engaged in this wooded area known as the wilderness. Grant's troops are mauled by the ferociously fighting rebels. That the fighting in the, I mean, it was so thick and that bodies fell and no one could find them. You know, for years sometimes afterwards, that after the war, people would just be walking through the woods and would come upon the remains of soldiers that were so thick in the woods that no one could find them to bury them. Grant orders his troops to disengage. And for the 5th time, the Union troops have been defeated in their attempt to march to Richmond. And they are marching off. The Union troops figure that Grant was leading them to retreat, as McDowell, McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker had. And the road coming out of the wilderness kind of went, if you can see, in 2 different directions. And all of the Union troops expected Grant to turn them towards Washington after this defeat in the wilderness. But Grant orders the army to stay to the right. Grant, even though he lost the battle, is not retreating back to Washington. And when the Union troops realized that they were not retreating, that Grant was leading them forward, an enormous cheer went up through the lines that this war, Grant was different, and Grant could take a punch on the nose and get up and keep fighting. And that's what the troops loved, at this point at least, about Grant. Grant is going to try to outflank General Lee. In doing so, letter C, Grant made the key realization that was going to end the war. And it's a terrible realization. And it's a terrible calculus that Grant figured out. Grant was the first Union commander to clearly realize, as he turned his army right and did not retreat back to Washington, Grant was the first Union commander to realize that all he needed to do was turn the war into a simple mathematical equation. And it was a terrible mathematical equation. And the mathematical equation said, the North has lots more men than the South. Even if Grant took twice as many casualties as the North, he would win the war. All he had to do, letter number 2, all Grant had to do was keep fighting, and eventually the South would run out of men. And that's what Grant did. He figured, I can take 2 or 3 casualties to every one of the South. There's lots more soldiers that I can draw on. Bobby Lee, General Lee, once he loses a man, there's no one left to replace him. It's a terrible calculus, but it's a calculus that Grant realized and was going to use. Letter D, after the Battle of the Wilderness, Grant turned south, trying to outflank General Lee. Lee, however, is good. Lee's really good. And he is not about to go gently into that good night. Lee maneuvers his army, and the 2 armies meet at another battle called the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Grant attacks different points along the line. There are heavy casualties on both sides. But again, Grant can replace his losses. Lee cannot. Grant continues to maneuver. Now he maneuvers south again. Lee follows. And at a place called the Battle of North Anna, Grant attempts to get around Lee's flank. Lee assumed at this battle a very good defensive position. He had a chance to do some real damage to Grant's army, but Lee was ill, and his subordinate... Now you remember, he's lost Jackson. He's lost Hood. Longstreet has gone down to help out in the South. Lee is depending on inexperienced commanders. Even the lower-ranking officers, the colonels and the majors, had been promoted because the original colonels and majors were killed. Lee is dealing with an inexperienced army by 1864, and because Lee is too sick to come to the battlefield at the Battle of North Anna, he misses an opportunity to really do some damage to the Union Army. So the battle is kind of inconclusive. Grant takes heavy casualties. He inflicts some casualties. Grant can make up his losses. Lee cannot. Grant maneuvers again, this time on a long march towards the town of Cold Harbor. Lee follows. It's early June by now, and Grant feels that Lee's Army of Northern Virginia must be exhausted, and one good push, if Grant could just push, Lee's army would crack, and Grant could march straight to Richmond. But Lee has another trick up his sleeve. Lee builds trenches and earthworks, and puts, no barbed wire yet, but obstacles in the field. It previews, if you know anything about World War I, that the Battle of Cold Harbor kind of previewed World War I. That the Southern troops dug in these trenches and dugouts, and Grant assaulted Lee. And he outnumbers Lee terribly. And Grant's troops are just cut down, like Union troops haven't been cut down since Fredericksburg at Marye's Heights. After 2 days of these assaults, Grant stopped. Grant was willing to take casualties. We know that about Grant. He was very willing to take casualties, but he was not willing to just throw his army away. He earned, quote-unquote, rabbit ears, he earned the nickname Butcher Grant for his actions at Cold Harbor. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Union casualties to very few Confederate. Or not even hundreds, excuse me, there's the numbers right there. There's 1,850 Union deaths and only 83 for the Confederacy. But that still does not stop Grant. He can't march on to Richmond, so he says, all right, I'm just going to go around. And he continues marching around. Lee is forced to follow. And now what Grant starts to do, number 7, on to Petersburg, despite these terrible casualties, heads southeast again, heading for the vital rail junction at the Virginia town of Petersburg. Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, there's a railroad that run, there's several railroads actually, that run through Petersburg up into Richmond. And if Grant can take Petersburg, he can cut those railroads and force the Confederates to evacuate their capital. So now Grant says, all right, we're not going to head for Richmond, we're going to head for Petersburg and cut off the Confederate supplies. And he starts leaving chunks of his army behind, which of course forces Lee to leave chunks of his army behind. Grant assaults these lines a few times throughout the summer, including at the Battle of the Crater, but has very little effect except to have long casualties. But what Grant keeps doing, he just keeps extending the line, which makes Lee forced to keep extending the line. If Grant can turn that line and get in at Petersburg, he's got the prize. But Lee is still too strong. Lee settles down in his earthworks. Unhappily, Lee doesn't like this style of warfare, but he's perfectly willing to fight it. Grant, Leonard, this is 7D, Grant settles down for a siege. And Grant knew he had the calculus. Grant knew that he had time and numbers on his side. And if he could just wear Lee down, he could win the war. The results of this Overland Campaign. First of all, Grant earns his reputation as a bloody but effective commander. Despite taking much larger total casualties than Lee, look at the numbers. The total casualties for the Unions, 55,000. 32,000 for the Confederate, but Lee cannot replace any of his casualties. Grant can replace all of them and more. The other thing that Grant did, he pinned Lee to the earth. Lee was pinned to the ground. That Lee had to keep his army all along that curve, if you will. Because if he gave up anywhere, then Grant's army would come right in. Lee could no longer maneuver. He simply had to try to hang on. And as 1864 drew to a close, and these troops started living in these cold, muddy trenches throughout the winter, everyone knew it was just a matter of time. He couldn't break Lee's lines yet, but Lee can only hang on for so long. In November of 1864, when Lincoln is reelected, the last real hope of the Confederacy is gone. But that doesn't mean they stop fighting. Number 4, the Naval War in 1864. By the end of 1864, the Union had captured or shut down every single Confederate port except for Wilmington, North Carolina. Blockade runners still slip through the Union ships here and there, but they're so fast that they have to be small and slender and quick. They don't carry much in the way of cargo. The Confederates try technology, the CSS Hunley, the world's first submarine to sink an enemy warship. It's another Confederate attempt, a desperate attempt to break the blockade, and the Hunley succeeds. It destroys a Union blockade ship, but a storm comes up and the submarine sinks on its way back to port. On the diplomatic front, number 5, as defeat for the South became more evident, there is no chance anymore for help from Britain and France. Britain and France instead start to patch up their relationship with the United States. The British still try to help some Confederate ships run the blockade as far as they can get away with. But no new ships are built in British ports. The British stop accepting, Confederate, promises for loans. That now the British and the French kind of look and say, hey, this is going to be over pretty soon, and we have to have a good relationship with the United States afterwards. So the Confederacy is kind of left abandoned. And as New Year's Day, 1865 dawned, President Lincoln had been reelected. All hope for foreign intervention in the South was gone. Sherman had cut his swath across Atlanta. The Deep South had kind of stopped fighting. The only thing that really remained in the South was the spirit and the tenacity of General Lee up in Virginia and his veterans, his hard, battle-tested, hungry, tough, shoeless, by this point, veterans who were defending the Confederate capital to the last of their strength. And 1865 would be kind of the fate of what happened to that army there in Virginia. 1 year to go. And Lee, being the aggressive commander that he was, now Lee attacked on both sides and eventually forced General Hooker to withdraw. There was other action around the town of Fredericksburg again, and to make a long story short, the end of the battle, the rest of the battle, other Confederate forces forced the entire Union Army, which outnumbered the Confederates over 2-1, to withdraw north of the river. The aftermath. The Battle of Chancellorsville is traditionally described as General Lee's greatest victory. Why? And rightfully so. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, he read his opponent like a book, took the initiative, split his army in the face of the enemy, forced Hooker to abandon the 1863 invasion of the South. The casualties on both sides were enormous, 30,000 combined. But even though the North took more casualties than the South, in total, the South had more men killed, the North had more men wounded and missing and captured. But the South, by 1863, is starting to run short on men. You could tell. The Army's 60,000. The Army that is facing it is 125,000. Letter B. This is important to keep in mind for the rest of the war. The casualties were enormous, but the South could ill afford to lose that many men. The North, with its much larger population, could replace those men. The South could not. However, after this battle, that's not what's on people's minds in the North. Northern morale, people's willingness to fight this war, sunk to a lower level than it ever had been. The invasion of 1861 had failed. The Peninsula Campaign had failed. Burnside had failed. Hooker had failed. And people stopped volunteering for the Army. So much so, letter A, that because the volunteerism began to dry up, the politicians began considering a draft. That's an important concept, aftermath of this battle. Letter C, another consequence, the loss of Jackson. A lot of people are going to blame the Confederate loss at Gettysburg a month or two later on the fact that Jackson was not there, and that Lee was depending on less experienced and less aggressive generals. Hooker's performance in battle was highly criticized, rightfully so, and Lincoln began looking around for still another commander to lead this army. Remember, Grant hasn't even won at Vicksburg yet. Okay, this is all before Vicksburg. However, the war cannot be won by the South with Lee simply defending Richmond. Lee still believes he needs that knockout blow to the North. So Lee looks at the North and says their morale is so low that we're going to invade the North again. One more victory, and Northern morale will crack, and they'll be forced to recognize the Confederacy. He gathers up men from all around the South, 75,000 he gets his army up to, and Lee invades the North, aiming for the capital of the state of Pennsylvania at Harrisburg. And that march up towards Harrisburg is what is going to lead, letter C, to the Battle of Gettysburg, which we will obviously talk about in class. Gettysburg is a direct result of Chancellorsville. The victory at Chancellorsville sinks Northern morale so low that Lee thinks all that is required is one more win, and the war will be over. That is very important to remember when you watch the movie Gettysburg and when you go to the battlefield. Lee knew in his heart that just one more win would end the war victoriously for his side. So that's where we stand in the East in the summer of 1863. What's going on in the Naval War? Very quickly. Throughout 1863, the size and strength of the Union Navy continued to grow and the blockade grew tighter, preventing Southern trade from going on, preventing it from exporting its cotton, preventing it from importing weapons. The Confederacy commissioned, letter B, several commerce raiders. They are ships that are designed to attack and destroy Union trade. The most famous of these are the CSS Alabama and the CSS Shenandoah. They're built in British shipyards, which angers the Americans, of course, the Unionists. They're mere annoyances. They're annoying. They're good propaganda for the South. They sink some Union ships. They disrupt some Union trade. But two ships are not going to destroy the entire trade of the mighty, powerful, economically huge North. And letter 5, diplomacy. By the end of 1863, with the loss at Gettysburg, all hope that the South had that England and France would come to their aid had vanished. By the end of 1863, the South knew that it was on its own. So we'll wait for Gettysburg, and then 1864 and 1865.